especial relevancia en el actual escenario de la salud pública global. Esta conferencia estará a cargo del doctor Jeffrey D. Klausner, profesor de la Escuela de Medicina Keck de la Universidad del Sur de California, destacado investigador en salud pública y epidemiología clínica y referente internacional en el estudio, prevención y control del VIH y de las infecciones de transmisión sexual. La conferencia se desarrollará en inglés, por lo cual contaremos con traducción simultánea para quienes no lo pueden escuchar directamente. Los equipos correspondientes están disponibles en la entrada del auditorio por si acaso. La trayectoria del doctor Klausner se caracteriza por un firme compromiso con la investigación científica, rigurosa, la innovación en salud pública y la traducción del conocimiento en políticas y prácticas que impactan directamente en la vida de las personas. Para nuestra universidad, su presencia tiene un significado especial porque desde 1999 el doctor Klausner ha colaborado estrechamente con lo que ahora es el Centro de Investigación Interdisciplinaria en Sexualidad, SIDA y Sociedad, el CIS, aportando no solo la experiencia académica y científica, sino también una valiosa visión de cooperación internacional basada en el respeto, el intercambio de saberes y la construcción conjunta de conocimiento. Para comenzar, tendremos la oportunidad de seguir al doctor Carlos Cáceres en un breve recorrido por la destacada trayectoria profesional y académica del doctor Klausner. Luego, el doctor Klausner presentará la conferencia anunciada, el cambiante contexto de las infecciones de transmisión sexual y la salud humana, y finalmente tendrá lugar la entrega del diploma que acredita al doctor Jeffrey Klausner como profesor extraordinario honorario de la Universidad peruana Cayetano Heredia. Distinción que reconoce su invaluable contribución a la investigación, la docencia y la cooperación académica con nuestra institución. Entonces, le doy ahora la palabra al doctor Carlos Cáceres. Primero, un aplauso para el doctor Klausner, por favor.
Doctora Yesenia Musayón, vicerectora académica de la Universidad, estimadas autoridades, profesoras, profesores, investigadores, estudiantes, invitados y público en general. La designación como profesor honorario en la Universidad peruana Cayetano Heredia es una distinción otorgada por el Consejo Universitario a propuesta de 5 profesores principales, a académicos nacionales o extranjeros de alto prestigio que sin pertenecer ordinariamente a la institución son reconocidos por sus méritos, producción científica o aportes. Esta noche tendremos la satisfacción de incorporar como profesor honorario al doctor Jeffrey Klausner y será un honor para mí presentarles una semblanza de su notabilísima trayectoria profesional, no sin antes indicar que también reconozco en Jeff al colega convencido del valor de la equidad, que busca el pleno desarrollo de los colaboradores y que comparte tiempo y recursos con generosidad para el progreso de los pupilos de aquí y de allá. Jeffrey Klausner es un médico e investigador reconocido internacionalmente que no solo destaca en indicadores tradicionales de productividad científica, de hecho cuenta con 700 publicaciones revisadas por pares, sino que también ha desarrollado una carrera caracterizada por colaboraciones de largo plazo y alto impacto en Perú y otros países de ingresos bajos y medios, así como por un compromiso excepcional con la mentoría y el desarrollo de capacidades. Durante más de 2 décadas, el doctor Klausner ha desarrollado una de las colaboraciones de investigación más duraderas entre Estados Unidos y Perú en el campo de las infecciones de transmisión sexual, ITS, ¿no? La prevención de VIH y la epidemiología de enfermedades infecciosas, caracterizada por rigor científico e interés por el fortalecimiento institucional y la formación de futuros líderes en salud global. Experiencia durante la formación. En 1989, a un estudiante de medicina el doctor Klausner viajó a Zaire, en África Central. En ese momento, la epidemia de SIDA y el profundo efecto del VIH-SIDA en África apenas se estaban describiendo. Conocí a grandes científicos y epidemiólogos de la OMS, el Instituto de Medicina Tropical de Amberes, Bélgica, los NIH y el CDC, recuerda Jeff. El viaje me abrió los ojos y la mente ante las posibilidades de la salud pública y la investigación. Quizá idealicé la situación, pero buscaba tomar lo mejor de la medicina estadounidense, su tecnología y conocimiento, y aplicarlo a los problemas de salud en el mundo en desarrollo. Al regresar a Estados Unidos, el doctor Klausner completó su formación médica en Cornell. También obtuvo un máster en salud pública con especialización en salud internacional y epidemiología en Harvard y completó su residencia médica en el New York University Bellevue Hospital Center en Nueva York en los años 90, cuando la mortalidad por SIDA alcanzaba sus niveles más altos. Él recuerda su frustración por no poder hacer mucho, salvo intentar controlar los síntomas, ofrecer compasión y esperanza, y esa frustración se convirtió en la base de su interés por la prevención. Sin tratamientos, solo se podía prevenir la transmisión del VIH, y fue por ello que Jeff consideró mejor estudiar otras infecciones de transmisión sexual, como la sífilis y la gonorrea. Estados Unidos había logrado controlarlas y quizá podría aplicarse respuestas similares a la lucha contra el VIH. Trabajo en Estados Unidos y Sudáfrica. De 1998 a 2009, Jeff fue director del Servicio de Prevención y Control de ITS en el Departamento de Salud Pública en San Francisco, profesor de medicina de UCSF, la Universidad de California en San Francisco, y médico adjunto en el Hospital General de San Francisco. Allí ayudó a identificar factores de riesgo para VIH e ITS e implementó programas novedosos de prevención desde una perspectiva de salud pública. Ayudó a crear el St. James Infirmary, ¿no?, la primera clínica de salud y seguridad laboral para trabajadores sexuales, y Magnet, una clínica comunitaria de salud sexual gestionada por pares, para hombres gay. También tuvo una experiencia laboral fuera de Estados Unidos. De 2009 a 2011 fue jefe de la rama de VIH y tuberculosis en la oficina del CDC en Pretoria, en Sudáfrica, ¿no?, liderando el programa PEPFAR de ese país para atención y tratamiento de VIH. De vuelta en Estados Unidos, se estableció en Los Ángeles, donde actualmente reside, habiendo sido profesor primero de UCLA y actualmente de la Universidad del Sur de California. Trabajo en Perú. El doctor Klausner comenzó a colaborar con Perú en 1999, con una alianza entre el equipo liderado por el doctor Thomas Coates de la Universidad de California en San Francisco y el equipo de Cayetano Heredia, liderado por mi persona en lo que hoy es el Centro de Investigación Interdisciplinaria en Sexualidad, SIDA y Sociedad, en Cayetano Heredia, obtuvo financiamiento del NIH para un estudio multicéntrico sobre prevención de VIH que involucró también a China, India, Rusia y Zimbabue. Nosotros teníamos el componente de Perú. Luego de ese proyecto, tal colaboración ha continuado sin interrupciones, ¿no?, a través de múltiples proyectos, múltiples iniciativas de investigación financiadas por NIH y CDC. Con la participación adicional del Ministerio de Salud del Perú y otras organizaciones comunitarias, este esfuerzo colaborativo ha permitido avanzar en la comprensión de las dinámicas de transmisión de las ITS y el VIH en Lima y la costa peruana. Ha abordado la sífilis, la gonorrea, la clamidia, el virus herpes simple y el VIH entre poblaciones vulnerables, incluidos hombres que tienen sexo con hombres, mujeres trans, trabajadoras sexuales y comunidades urbano-populares, ¿no? En el momento actual, el doctor Klausner tiene interés creciente en la sífilis congénita. El trabajo del doctor Klausner en Perú ha priorizado de forma constante lo que se llama Translational Research e Implementation Research, es decir, investigación para la traducción del conocimiento científico en saber práctico y la implementación de programas. Los estudios colaborativos en los que participó evaluaron estrategias de notificación de parejas, pruebas diagnósticas rápidas, manejo sindrómico y eficacia del tratamiento en entornos clínicos y comunitarios del mundo real. Estos proyectos permitieron el desarrollo del equipo del CIS en investigación epidemiológica, así como en investigación de laboratorio, la cual ha incluido primero el uso de pruebas comerciales para estimar prevalencias y en los últimos años la implementación de estudios de biología molecular, generando evidencias que influyeron en estrategias del control de ITS más allá de las fronteras del Perú. Ampliamente citadas, las investigaciones que ha publicado con el grupo de Cayetano Heredia son de consulta obligada en la investigación sobre ITS en América Latina. Mentoría de excelencia y otros logros. La mentoría ha sido fundamental en el enfoque de colaboración del Dr. Klausner. En el Perú, a través de Cayetano e instituciones afiliadas, ha sido mentor de estudiantes de pregrado, residentes, doctorandos, becarios, postdoctorales y profesores junior, muchos de los cuales ahora ejercen papeles de liderazgo en investigación de enfermedades infecciosas y salud pública en el Perú y a nivel internacional. Ha participado de comités de tesis y ha colaborado en numerosas publicaciones junto a investigadores peruanos para investigación, nombramientos docentes y roles de liderazgo nacional e internacional. Su enfoque de mentoría prioriza la transferencia de capacidades, el apoyo en la preparación de grants y la integridad científica, asegurando la sostenibilidad más allá de los proyectos individuales. El Dr. Klausner también ha extendido este modelo de colaboración orientada a la mentoría a otros entornos tales como Uganda, India, Filipinas, Botsuana, Zimbabue, Sudáfrica y actualmente Vietnam, aunque los más numerosos son los de Estados Unidos. En UCSF, UCLA y la Universidad del Sur de California ha asesorado a más de 150 personas en todas las etapas de su carrera, ¿no? Y hablo de asesoría persona a persona, intensiva. Muchos de sus antiguos pupilos ocupan ahora puestos docentes en instituciones académicas de prestigio, cargo de liderazgo en los CDC y NIH y puestos de alto nivel en programas de control de ITS y VIH a nivel mundial. Su mentoría ha sido reconocida mediante repetidas nominaciones a premios institucionales por el éxito de sus alumnos. Además de la mentoría científica, el Dr. Klausner ha contribuido a la educación y el desarrollo de capacidades a través de programas de enseñanza, habiendo participado activamente en el programa de becas de salud global GLOCAL, apoyado por Fogarty. Estos programas reflejan una filosofía coherente, ¿no? La investigación en salud global debe basarse en la equidad, el liderazgo local y la mentoría sostenida. Fuera de ello, el Dr. Klausner ha sido consultor recurrente del CDC, los NIH y la OMS, entornos en los que su acertada perspectiva merece la atención de sus pares. También es un popular conferencista que no se inhibe de abordar temas políticamente complejos como los relativos a las prácticas sexuales en el contexto de la salud pública, ¿no? Donde a veces hay que discutir sobre qué cosa es posible y qué cosa no, y qué cosa debe hacerse y qué cosa no. Unas palabras finales y aquí paso al inglés para una mayor proximidad del mensaje. In short, Dr. Jeff Klausner's international career is defined by a rare combination of loyal collaboration, scientific impact, and excellence in mentoring. Its collaboration with Cayetano Heredia in Peru represents a model for ethical, productive, and long-lasting research in global health. This collaboration has resulted in numerous peer-reviewed publications, large grants, and pleasant memories of researchers in training who then went on their own way. Thanks to these efforts, the science of STIs and HIV prevention has taken concrete steps, training generations of researchers along the way prepared to address their global challenges. I do not want to close these words without a personal note. Apart from his many undeniable professional merits, Jeff Klausner, whom I am honored to consider not only a colleague but also a dear friend, is someone who, over the course of a quarter of a century, has not only shared with us his scientific curiosity and great investigative creativity, but has also shown us his commitment to equitable collaborations, his tireless interest in the implementation of scientific advances in favor of the population, and his generosity in time and resources. With the additional support of colleagues such as Kelly Kakonda, also a USC professor with a long career at Cayetano, as well as Jeff's pupils who visit us seasonally, and together with a growing team of Heredian researchers at CIS, we have managed to constitute a thriving nucleus of scientific collaboration that still has much to contribute. Jeff, symbolically, welcome to this house that has been yours for many years. And of course, thank you very much.
Gracias, Carlos. Yo quería salirme un poquitito del guión para también, tantos años que conozco a Jeff Klausner, hace 20 años, cuando también compartía con el CIS y quería resaltar la cantidad de investigadores, ahora varios doctores, que él ha formado aquí en Cayetano y en el CIS. Y yo diría que Jeff Klausner es un claro peruanista. Además, porque le gusta mucho el ceviche. Muy bien. Entonces, ahora sí, vamos a invitar a subir al escenario al doctor Jeff Klausner, profesor de la Escuela de Medicina de la Universidad del Sur de California, para presentar su conferencia El cambiante contexto de las infecciones de transmisión sexual y la salud humana. Agradecemos al doctor Klausner por su presentación y luego lo vamos a dejar en el estado.
Muchas gracias, and it's a real pleasure to be here and be with my academic family in Lima, Peru. My wife, unfortunately, could not join me today, and she wishes she could be here, Tammy, and she's always a little bit skeptical that I don't have another family here in Lima and another wife and other children here, but I tell her, no, I have my academic family here, and I'm very pleased and thankful to be able to share today with you in about 30 minutes. And let me put my timer on. 30 minutes, just some thoughts that I've had on the changing context of sexually transmitted infections and human health. So this is greetings from our current research team at the University of Southern California. You can see Dr. Kanda here on the left, and we have researchers currently working in India. We have Chibazor, who works now in Botswana in Southern Africa, and we have our clinical trials team. And it's a real, pleasure for me to give you a hello from Southern California. So what I'm going to cover is some of the history of how we've been thinking over the past 3 decades, how STIs have been considered in terms of research and research priorities. So we started off thinking about STI, sexually transmitted infections, as a marker, right? So it's a marker of exposure to certain sexual practices that would put people at risk for acquiring HIV. Also was a marker of that sexual behavior that could be used to demonstrate outcomes with HIV prevention trials. Historically, in many places, HIV incidence, or the number of new infections, relatively rare. So in order to do studies quickly and efficiently, you need to have other markers that are more frequent that you can show can impact your ultimate outcome. Then we move to more focus on syphilis diagnostics and implementation science. And implementation science, as Professor Caceres mentioned, is an important area of being able to translate scientific findings into practice. And for me, I always wanted to be practical and really bring the work from the laboratory to the population and to the clinic. And then more recently, a focus on sexually transmitted infections and maternal health, and then the road ahead. So in the mid-1980s and 1990s, really people saw sexually transmitted infections as a deadly synergy. There was very strong evidence that certain STIs, particularly STIs that cause genital ulcers, so syphilis, herpes, chancroid, provided what we called a portal of entry for HIV. And it made sense biologically. So if people had a sore, they were more likely to get HIV infected through that sore. And then in the other direction, if they had genital discharge diseases that are caused by things like chlamydia, gonorrhea, or trichomonas, that inflammation in the cervix or that inflammation in the urethra enhanced the amount of HIV, and then that could enhance the spread of infection forward. So there was a lot of effort at the time in the late 1980s and early 90s to see if we could prevent and control STIs as a direct means of HIV prevention. So there were very large community-level trials conducted in Uganda called the Rakai trial. There were large trials in Tanzania called the Mwanza trial, and these trials ultimately provided mixed results. So in one trial, it showed that STI prevention and control reduced HIV, but then in another trial, it failed to replicate. And then there was a third trial that also failed to replicate, and people were a little bit confused and did not fully understand about why the effect of STIs was not clear when you prevent and control STIs on the population level. And that really ended up, unfortunately, taking the wind out of the sails. And people started to lose enthusiasm for STI control as a means of HIV prevention. And so we moved away a little bit from STI control more toward direct behavioral intervention. So we understood there were certain sexual risk behavior, having condomless sex, having a frequent number of new partners, something called a sexual network. So there were researchers such as Daniel Halperin and others, Marion Koopman, who were looking at very what they call tight sexual networks. And I always try to explain this idea is if you think about a pinball, going through a network, if there's a lot of channels for that ball to go down, it can go down very quickly. But if there's only one channel or there's breaks in those channels, it'll go through very slowly. So these sexual networks became an explanation for why certain key populations in the Americas or why the general population in Southern Africa could be a mechanism for a faster spread of HIV. So there are a lot of behavioral interventions to try to disrupt those networks. Called it, get off the network. Those were not very effective, but it did start to concentrate people's thinking on key populations, that there were certain subgroups within the populations that may be more likely to contribute to the spread of infection. Also, biomedical interventions like male circumcision, which were shown to be very effective, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And then in the Americas, a greater focus on substance use treatment, right? Because substance use, and I know there are some researchers in the audience thinking about chemsex and crystal methamphetamine, contribute substantially in the Americas to the continued risk behavior and spread of HIV and STIs. So the thought was if you can control, prevent substance use, mitigate substance use, you can mitigate HIV prevention. And that kind of background formed Dr. Casares and I first collaboration called the National Institute of Mental Health Community Popular Opinion Leader Trial, which was the 5-country trial he mentioned in Peru, India, Russia, China, and Zimbabwe. So he and I were put in charge of the program in Peru with Tom Coates from UCSF, and then there were others in these other countries, and then I was also put in charge of the 5 countries' biological outcomes, which meant that we were going to use STIs as the outcome measure for the HIV prevention interventions. And unfortunately, in both arms of the intervention, fortunately we saw a behavioral decline, but unfortunately it was equal between both groups, between the intervention group, where we trained community leaders to go out and promote sexual behavior change, and the control group, where we just brought people together without any specific messages, and there was no effect on community STI or HIV incidence. However, this very intense collaboration with substantial amount of investment from the NIH developed research partnerships and infrastructure that last till today. So that was a really amazing benefit of that collaboration. And for example, this is our Cayetano Heredia Sexual Health Laboratory that was started in 1999 that continues to this day based on that early collaboration. And this laboratory really has become the hub and that nucleus for a lot of our work that we do in the community around Lima and elsewhere in central Peru. So now we move to the second phase, which is the area of HIV and highly active antiretroviral therapy. So I was a physician, as you heard about, in San Francisco in the mid-1990s, and at that time we didn't have any treatments. So people would cycle through different treatments, their virus would become resistant, and we didn't have a lot to offer people. But then, boom, in 1996 at the Vancouver AIDS Conference, there's an announcement that combination therapy, triple combination therapy, virus does not become resistant on triple combination therapy. So suddenly, what we had known was true in tuberculosis, right? Tuberculosis, we always treat with multiple drugs to prevent resistance. And for some reason, we hadn't applied that same idea to HIV treatment, but now we had, and we were able to show that with triple combination therapy, people's viral load could be suppressed, what we call undetectable equals untransmissible, or U equal U, and the public health implications of that were profound, that people who had suppressed viral load could not spread HIV. The Swiss were the first to adopt a policy around that and promote that viral suppression, what was a primary prevention strategy. And then from the development of these antivirals came PrEP, right, pre-exposure prophylaxis. And in people with HIV who were virally suppressed or people without HIV on PrEP, we found that the STIs were no longer an important cofactor in either transmission or acquisition, that these antivirals were so good at suppressing or blocking the acquisition of HIV that people could have syphilis, they could have chlamydia, they could have gonorrhea, they could have herpes, and they still could not spread HIV. So STIs became much less relevant for HIV prevention. So we had spent 10 to 15 years working on STIs as a means of HIV prevention, what was really no longer a tenable strategy. And that's when we shifted to think about the STIs in and of themselves. So we have three different NIH-funded Picasso trials, and the early Picasso trial started in about 2009, 2010, but our trials were focused on trying to define the epidemiologic, so the frequency and distribution of syphilis among primarily men and trans women here in Lima, Peru, and the immunologic characteristics, particularly of those with first-time or repeat infection. Because as physicians, we observe that when someone has an infection for the first time with syphilis, they tend to have more symptoms, a longer duration of symptoms, and more severe symptoms. When someone has an infection for a second or third or fourth time, their symptoms tend to be more mild or transient. So the thought was, could we understand that biologically, immunologically, to characterize what the immune response was that was contributing to a more mild syphilis the second or third time around. And based on understanding that immune response, perhaps we could develop a vaccine that could replicate that immune response in people who never had been previously infected. And if people were less likely to have symptoms, it's really the symptoms and the signs, the lesions, the sores, the rashes that spread syphilis. If those lesions, sores, and rashes did not occur or they occurred for a shorter duration, this vaccine then could prevent the spread. So it would not necessarily be a vaccine that blocked infection, but it would be a vaccine that blocked the spread of infection. So that was the idea. And then as part of that, we would also focus on developing new diagnostics. When I was at the Maternidad today, helping celebrate the 200th anniversary of that Maternidad hospital, I was reminded that the syphilis tests that we use today were from 1906. So the syphilis tests we use today are based on scientific principles invented 120 years ago. They're perhaps a little bit technically better, but it's the same idea of antibodies against treponemes or antibodies against certain antigens in the human body. So we are desperate for new diagnostics and new methods to determine who has syphilis, who doesn't have syphilis, who's infected, who's infectious, etc. So as part of those diagnostics, we had a brilliant collaboration with one of our UCLA PhD students, Claire Bristow, and the laboratory team at the Sexual Health Laboratory. And they did nearly a dozen studies on rapid point-of-care diagnostic tests and rapid point-of-care diagnostic tests for syphilis, and then a combination test. Again, no one had really thought for some reason about combination treatment for HIV, and no one had thought about combination diagnostic tests for HIV and syphilis. So we got the manufacturers to put together the tests into one cassette, one cartridge, and then we studied those tests, how they perform, what kind of acceptability they had. And now it was amazing to see in my 3 clinic visits over this week so far, each clinic I went to, including the Maternidad, they all use these combination dual rapid tests. So if you're pregnant, you're automatically going to get tested, not only for HIV, but for syphilis. But syphilis was always the poor sister. Syphilis was always, we don't have enough money, we don't have enough resources, do we really need to test for syphilis? But now that it's attached to the HIV test, you can't get an HIV test in many of these settings without testing for syphilis. So that simple type of structural intervention really changed practice in most of the world. And now WHO has the dual HIV syphilis test at what they call A0. So that's the first recommended test for someone who has in antenatal care, a pregnant woman, and someone who's not been previously tested. And that's direct result of the work here in Lima and at the Lima laboratory. Also, I wanted to bring this forward as this was an interesting project that I know Kelika and the team spent a lot of effort on. And people may have heard of PET scans, so positron emission tomography. So it's a very fancy, expensive scan that's used in cancer patients to see if your cancer has responded to the cancer therapy. And we convinced the NIH to allow us to use this scan in patients with syphilis. No one had ever used a PET scan in patients with syphilis before. We recruited 6 patients with secondary syphilis, so they had early syphilis with rashes. They were recently infected with syphilis. They went through the PET scan, and interestingly, 5 of 6 had inflammation of the aorta. So I think you can see this yellow starts to outline part of the aorta. So here is the large aorta blood vessel, and you can see it's lit up because of inflammation due to secondary syphilis. So this was quite striking that early on in infection, people already had an immune response in different major blood vessels. And this is why when it goes untreated, it can lead to chronic conditions of the aorta, aortic aneurysms, aortic valve problems, and really was an amazing tool to understand some of the pathogenesis of syphilis. And that also was done here in collaboration with the radiologists. Lastly, in this area of discovery, there was always a concern, okay, when we have these rapid tests, we can't predict easily what someone's titer is. And the titer in syphilis is how we measure people's response to therapy. So Silver Vargas, who's in the audience and a recent successful PhD degree candidate, looked at these measures of the values from the reader from the rapid test and then correlated them with the RPR titers. And you can see there's a very strong and direct relationship. So with some of the rapid tests that use the reader, there's one that uses the reader, we can actually use that rapid test to monitor response to treatment. It's not in clinical practice yet. It probably still has to be undergo some further validation, but this is the kind of discovery science that we're able to do with some of our collaborations here. And then another aspect of the Picasso studies, we've been typically focused for 120 years on the same antigens and the same antibodies that respond to those antigens in syphilis diagnostics. So through a collaboration with colleagues at University of Washington and a company in San Diego, and the work of patient recruitment here, specimen collection, specimen shipping to San Diego and University of Washington, we began to identify new epitopes and new antigens that could be used for diagnosing and monitoring syphilis. So a very good example of again, the discovery science that could have future applications in diagnostics. So that's what I call phase 2, right? So phase 2 was we're moving a little bit away from STIs for HIV prevention research to STIs of themselves, understanding the biology, to now something that part of my reason for coming this week was to launch more work in this area here in Lima. So it's been known for many years that curable STIs, chlamydia, gonorrhea, trichomonas, may increase the risk of preterm birth. There's been meta-analysis, systematic reviews that show a strong association between these infections and preterm birth. Preterm birth is a major problem worldwide. 98% of premature complications occur in low and middle income countries. 4 in 10 child deaths occur under 5 years of age. There's over 10 million preterm births, and 1 in 6 babies are born preterm in many low resource settings. It's estimated that in 2022, about 2.5 million newborns died in the first month, many of that from preterm birth. And because of the United States withdrawal and the closure of USAID, we're expecting that to more than double. Because of the USAID closure and the withdrawal of the United States from many multilateral programs, we're expecting that to double. So we think that infections in pregnancy lead to inflammation and accelerated cervical ripening and premature labor. There's bloodstream infections like HIV and syphilis. There's also microbial invasion upward from the cervix into the uterine cavity. And there's also inflammation at the cervix from some of these infections as well. And this was an example of work done by one of my colleagues at UCSF, Craig Cohn, who looked at the inflammatory marker IL-10 and showed that in patients with STIs, this inflammatory marker, this cytokine, was 2 or 3 times as high as patients without an STI. And these were in women with gonorrhea, chlamydia, or bacterial vaginosis. We also were able to replicate some of this in some of our work in Botswana, showing that pregnant women with chlamydia had different cytokine profiles. And cytokines are the chemical messengers. They're the messengers between the cells that occur in inflammation. And so some cytokines are protective against inflammation, some are advance or cause inflammation, and it's that balance of the cytokines that the infections cause because of the immune response that can have a negative impact on the pregnancy. So we wanted to look at, in a very systematic way, whether STIs, screening and treatment could prevent preterm birth. So we did studies all over the world, Botswana, South Africa, here in Peru, Vietnam, and Haiti, and we found, not surprisingly, every pregnant woman we recruited was happy to be tested. We were able to treat nearly 100%, and most were able to treat it on the same day, and almost all were able to treat it within a week. The prevalence of these STIs, as you might imagine, varied substantially by the epidemiologic setting. So in a place like Haiti, nearly 45% of pregnant women had one of these 3 curable STIs. South Africa, about 40%. In Peru, so in Peru, at the Maternidad, 10% of women coming in had a chlamydial infection. 1 out of 10 women coming into the Maternidad hospital had a positive test for chlamydia. They were all treated as part of that study, but we still need to think about new studies on what to do about those positive women coming in with a chlamydia infection. So we did 2 prospective studies. One was done in Botswana, where we randomized different clinics to screening or no screening, and we found that there was a trend. This wasn't significant across all the clinics, but there was a trend in the intervention groups had lower rates of preterm or low birth weight, a nice drop in preterm birth and low birth weight, but again, a trend as the numbers were modest overall. And when we looked at a subgroup of women who were pregnant or had not delivered previously, nulliparous women, screening and treatment reduced preterm birth or low birth weight by 80%. So that's a very powerful effect in this subpopulation. But as people know, in clinical evidence, people are always a little bit skeptical about subgroup analysis and what we call post hoc analysis, so they want you to do another study, a prospective study, to prove that again. So we did a prospective, much larger study in East London, South Africa, and we built these temporary research stations at the 4 different clinics. We did a 3-arm study where there were 3 different interventions, and our primary outcome was preterm or low birth weight. Women had to be 18 years of older at their first visit, less than 27 weeks gestation, and intended to deliver within the study catchment area. We did point of care screening with the Gene Expert system, and the 3 interventions were either one-time screening, so just screening once and treated if they're positive at their first visit, 2-time screening, so at their first visit and then at 30 to 34 weeks, versus the standard of care, which meant if they have symptoms, they were treated, but if they were asymptomatic, they didn't receive any treatment whatsoever. We enrolled 2,247 women, some disruptions during the COVID pandemic, but they were equally allocated across the 3 different intervention arms, and their baseline characteristics were also very similar. And you can see that 16%, so about 1 out of 6, had chlamydia infection at baseline, about 5.5% had Neisseria gonorrhea, 10% had trich. So any pregnant woman coming in there, about 27% had a curable STI at their time of presentation, and most of those were asymptomatic. So they would not have been treated, they would not have been managed because they had no symptoms whatsoever. So the overall results, we found no significant difference in a composite outcome of preterm and or low birth weight. So there was a trend in the 2-time screening arm, but really there was no significant difference, and the effect was about 10%. But when we looked at outcome of preterm birth only, we did see a significant 23% reduction, so a relative risk of 0.77, and this indeed was highly significant. So again, it was not our primary outcome, but we did find additional evidence that 2-time screening reduced preterm birth by 23%. And now, as of July 2025, the WHO guidelines were updated to say that pregnant women who have no symptoms of STIs and are accessing health care and antenatal visits should be screened. So this is something we need to think about here in Peru, how to implement it, what populations might benefit from it, and how to evaluate it, because we have clinical evidence of benefit, we have recommendations, and we do have we do have the tests. We have the laboratory capacity to do that here. So what's next? And I'll be finishing up with a few slides about what's next. So thinking about our prevention of preterm, we have to be a little bit more holistic, right? So we sometimes in research, we get very focused in one area and one kind of intervention, which was STI screening and treatment, but we have to recognize that the etiology of things like preterm birth are very complex, and we need to sometimes think a little bit broader. So there's been researchers who focused on aspirin to prevent preterm birth. There's been researchers that have focused on vitamins or micronutrients to prevent preterm birth, and there's researchers like me who've been focused on infections in preterm birth. So we now are going to put all these together in a package, and we're going to test and see which combination of these, or all three, is the most effective at preventing preterm birth. And the idea is these are low-cost, safe interventions, and we can potentially have a substantial impact in reducing preterm birth. Also, as Carlos mentioned, we do a lot of work with affordable point-of-care diagnostics. So we are developing and have developed a very effective, rapid, inexpensive diagnostic for Neisseria gonorrhea, which is under $2 per test. And now we've combined that to make a $2 test for Neisseria gonorrhea and chlamydia trachomatis. So similarly, that we have this rapid combination test for syphilis and HIV, which is very inexpensive, easy to use, and can be scaled up. We're very close to having a marketable test that will work on urine or swabs for chlamydia and gonorrhea as well. Our current NIH Picasso study, as I mentioned, continues to advance. We're looking more deeply into immunology with Professor Iskra here at Cayetano Heredia, taking a deeper look at T cells, working with partners in Spain on T cell receptors, and then other collaborators in this space as well. And then, I've talked about how we've evolved from STIs and HIV, epidemiology and immunology of syphilis, rapid point-of-care diagnostics, STI treatment strategies to prevent preterm birth, and then as Professor Caceres mentioned, an increased emphasis now on also congenital syphilis, which because of its resurgence in the United States from 40 cases about 10 years ago to 4,000 cases a year last year, has gotten the national attention finally. So we hope we'll have some resources to be able to address congenital syphilis both here and back in the United States as well. So of course, none of this could be done without amazing partnerships and my Peruvian family and my love of ceviche and the team. And I want to thank everyone for their attention and our great collaborations today. Thank you very much.
Agradecemos mucho la interesante presentación que nos ha dado el doctor Klausner, y lo invitamos a permanecer, stay here, en el centro del estrado. Ahora invitamos al escenario a la señora vicerrectora académica, doctora Yesenia Musayón Oblitas, al vicerrector de investigación Carlos Cáceres Palacios, por favor, y a la señora Pilar Alay, secretaria general accesitaria de la Universidad, para el acto oficial.
Resolución de Consejo Universitario número 103 de fecha 28 de enero de 2025. Considerando que el señor rector de la Universidad Peruana, Cayetano Heredia, presentó a consideración del Consejo Universitario la Carta del Vicerrectorado de Investigación número 10-2026, la misma que está respaldada por 5 profesores principales de la universidad, a través de la cual solicitan el nombramiento del doctor Jeffrey Klausner como profesor extraordinario honorario de la Universidad Peruana, Cayetano Heredia. El citado doctor es un académico excepcional, premiado y reconocido a lo largo de su trayectoria profesional, académica y de investigación, tal cual lo ha descrito el doctor Carlos Cáceres Palacios, vicerrector de investigación, en su presentación el día de hoy. En ese orden de ideas, en el inciso C2 del artículo 2 del Reglamento del Personal Académico Docente de la Universidad, establece que profesores honorarios son aquellos académicos nacionales o extranjeros que, sin pertenecer a la universidad, se han hecho acreedores por sus méritos a esta distinción y son nombrados por el Consejo Universitario a propuesta de 5 profesores principales. En atención a los considerandos precedentes, en uso de las atribuciones que confiere el Estatuto de la Universidad y el acuerdo unánime de la sesión ordinaria del Consejo Universitario de esta universidad de fecha 28 de enero del 2026, se resuelve nombrar al doctor Jeffrey Klausner como profesor extraordinario honorario de la Universidad Peruana Cayetano Heredia y expedirle el diploma que lo acredite como tal. Regístrese, comuníquese y archívese. Consta una firma y sello del doctor Enrique Castañeda Saldaña, rector, y firma y sello de la doctora Geraldine Sidae Salazar Vargas, secretaria general.
Ahora invitamos al doctor Jeffrey Klausner. A few words. Spontaneous words.
A few spontaneous words. Well, it is wonderful to be recognized by my family of researchers and collaborators and scientists and people who care about the health of others and the health of the population. And there's still, appreciation for public health, which is, a challenge right now in the United States, where I'm from, where there seems to be an absence of empathy and caring for others. So it's really amazing to be in a place where those values still matter. I gave a talk once, and I said, that we start in our lives caring about ourselves. And not until we can really care about ourselves can we start to care about those immediately around us, which are our partners, our family, our immediate friends. And that's where, a lot of people's personal kind of evolution of caring stops. But doctors and researchers and public health practitioners, we care for strangers. Right, so we care for people that we'll never perhaps see again. We care for people that we never see, right? So we have an unusual, aspiration, and it's wonderful to be recognized for that, and it's wonderful to collaborate with people who share those values. So thank you very much.
Bueno, agradecemos a nuestro invitado especial por su visita, su presentación, sus palabras finales y a todos por su gentil asistencia y los invitamos a subir para el brindis de honor. Muy buenas noches a todos y todas.
Por favor, un favor, vamos a tomar una fotografía